Welcome to IEC, Becoming an Engineer, where we connect engineering education research with real-world practice, academia, and industry. Our goal is to create an inclusive space for dialogue, collaboration, and knowledge sharing across the engineering education sector in South Africa, positioning our unique challenges and innovations as a key voice in the global engineering education conversation. We explore the challenges and opportunities of engineering education in the global South, while linking our experiences to the broader international landscape. Whether you're an academic, industry professional, or a student curious about engineering education and its meaning for your future, this podcast offers meaningful discussions that go beyond research papers to unpack practical strategies for positive change in engineering education spaces.
My name is Leilani Smith.
And I'm Ruben Govender.
And in today's episode, we take a look into the intersection of engineering, society, history, and ethics, and how uncomfortable questions can change how we educate engineers for the future. Ruben, what's really struck me listening to Bruce was the questions he was asking, the questions about history, power, responsibility in engineering. And in particular, what really stayed with me, having some awareness of the module that he runs, as well as some of his recent work that he's published, is just how deep that conversation can run. And it's deeply personal, it's deeply cultural, it's within our context, and it really entangles with our identity as engineers as well. I would be curious to know what stood out for you.
So a lot of the questions and comments that Bruce was asking are really bringing discomfort out of the shadows and into plainer view. And that's not to provoke people with feelings of making people feel guilty, but to help us understand where we are and to help people grow. These questions around where was engineering as a practice institutionally complicit in injustices in the past? How has that shaped where we are today? And thinking about these things and understanding some of the extremely difficult, painful realities of our history, how does that shape how we as educators teach the current generation of students? How do we mentor the future generation of engineers into being leaders in industry in future?
Our guest today is Professor Bruce Kloot, whose journey blends engineering, anthropology, critical sociology, and a deep curiosity for how power, history, and identity shapes both engineers and the world they build. From researching extended degree programs to confronting uncomfortable truths about engineers' roles under apartheid, Bruce's work reminds us that engineering is never just technical, it's always social and sometimes deeply political. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So I want to start the questions by exploring a little bit about your journey. What drew you into engineering? What took you into anthropology? And how did this shape how you think about engineering education today?
Great. Well, what drew me into engineering? I was good at maths and science, and my dad refused to pay for a degree in zoology. So he took me to an industrial psychologist, and then she said I could be an environmental engineer. So I thought, that sounded great. Saw myself collecting test tubes of water at a marsh near a plant and, I don't know, going to the press and shutting down the plant or whatever. But that quickly evaporated because I didn't see anything to do with environment in the first year of the degree, in the first 3 years of the degree. Only towards the end of the degree it was anything to do with the environment. By that time I was really locked into completing the degree because I didn't want my dad to spend all that money and me get nowhere. And ended my chemical engineering degree, and then I got a bursary to study energy studies at the University of Cape Town. My gran saw an advert for a bursary in a newspaper in Cape Town and snipped it out and popped it in the post to me, and decided to apply. And I was the only person to apply. I was the only person to get the bursary. So I started studying energy studies at the University of Cape Town. Initially interested in I read an article. Actually, during my undergrad, in fourth year, we had a course kind of, I don't think it was called Engineering Society, but it was something like that. And there was actually an article there which looked at the energy efficiency of of natural farming techniques compared to industrialized farming, mechanized farming. And it's amazing that natural farming techniques with animal fertilizer and horse-drawn plows and things like that is much more energy efficient than mechanized farming with industrial fertilizers and fossil fuels powering tractors. So that interested me, but that wasn't actually what I was allowed to go and look at. So I ended up looking at a ESCOM case study in a rural area looking at renewable energy. Part of that journey was my supervisor asked someone to take me to the anthropology department to register for a master's. I wasn't formally registered, but they took me on for 6 months. And I remember that colleague said she had a master's in anthropology herself, I think, or sociology. And she said, right, we're going to get the engineer out of you, going to do a master's course in anthropology. So I studied for 6 months in a master's in anthropology. It was very interesting. I wasn't prepared for what I was encountering. It's kind of long essays every week. I don't know how many thousands of words. We had to write a new one every week, and it was a lot of work. But I studied a master's in methodology, so being exposed to this kind of social sciences methodologies and development, which was very, very interesting because the anthropology department is asking all sorts of postmodern questions around development and what is development and who are we as anthropologists and all sorts of interesting questions. So had a critical take on development, questioning this narrative that development is good and these underdeveloped countries or developing countries are going to somehow reach where the developed countries are. So very critical view on that. So that kind of started, I think, my critical thinking around society, I suppose, and then I guess shaping me in terms of thinking about things socially. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a sociologist, but I think it did shape me in a certain kind of way and thinking about society critically. So I like to do that.
Mm. How did that get you to doing the PhD in engineering education in the end? Like, how did you get to that, and what did you end up doing research on?
Good question. So, I ended up finishing my master's and then I actually went teaching. So I ended up teaching for 7.5 years at high school level, taught science at a couple of schools. One of them was a school that was a maths and science school for students from townships. And that was very interesting. And I think it exposed me also to the lingering effects of apartheid education as well. It was quite eye-opening actually to teach students from township schools. Quite incredible. I mean, I think I could go into that in detail, but I mean, I think just, I think growing up in in the kind of system that I did, what you call Model C school, or whatever, you don't really have an understanding of what students in township schools or rural schools are going through. I guess in terms of lack of resources and I guess, just kind of the way they're taught to learn. It's just really quite kind of what I might call surface learning or rote learning. I mean, that's quite a generalization, but it was very, very stark when I was teaching at that school. And that allowed me actually, when I left there to work on an extended degree program at University of Technology initially. And of course, with the background that I had, it helped me to be able to engage better with students on extended degree programs. So that was at the University of Technology. And then I got a job at UCT as an academic development lecturer, which we won't go into now what that is supposed to entail. Oh, well, I mean, I can say you're kind of the person that does everything that other people don't really want to do. So they just give you a job of being an academic development lecturer. But I became interested. Well, I guess I started talking with someone well known in engineering education circles, Jenny Case. And after a couple of meetings, she was like, okay, I can take you on as a PhD student. So I was like, oh, great. So I guess I'd kind of figured out that's what I had to do. I actually started my PhD before I moved to UCT. So I already had decided to go on that kind of journey. And it was, I really enjoyed my PhD. I mean, some people have horrible experiences, but I had an amazing experience. So I decided to study extended degree programs, which were the things that was the kind of program that I had taught on at the University of Technology where I was. I mean, one of the things that interested me is that the people teaching on this extended degree program didn't really know how the program was supposed to operate. They seemed to be all kind of operating in a very kind of free, kind of unconstrained space, and people could kind of do what they wanted to do. Yeah, so I thought I'd study them sociologically. So I was reading some of the literature around it, given my interest in these programs, and I found that I found two papers a decade apart, which were basically saying the same kind of thing. This is what we have to do going forward, and these are some of the drawbacks of these programs. So it led me to think that these extended degree programs, and this is early 2000s. These extended degree programs are kind of stuck. They kind of don't seem to be really moving forward. So I chose a theoretical framework, which I encountered also in reading around this PhD of that of Pierre Bourdieu, who's a French sociologist, and has he's got a theory around social power and about how social structures reproduce themselves. So that's why there's always inequality, and that's why the powerful can remain powerful. Because the society has this mechanism of reproducing itself, and higher education is one of the big parts of that whole system, where students are allegedly evaluated on merit, but actually Bourdieu says that that's just a smokescreen actually for the reproduction of economic power and social position. So yeah, I decided to use that framework, and I guess I could access it. It's not an easy framework to get your head around, but I think maybe my time in studying anthropology helped me, and very fertile framework, really productive, and I thought it was a great lens to use to look at this problem. So did my PhD in 5.5 years while I was working, and it was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I think just the learning process of the PhD itself, the outcomes of the PhD in terms of extended degree programs, I think probably not that useful, but I think quite insightful as well. So, and I guess it taught me how to research. That's the idea of a PhD.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think maybe we can also just, I guess, define extended programs a little bit here, just for the audience. So I'm just going to segue to that, Bruce, a little bit. So the research on extended programs could be quite insightful. And Bruce, if you don't mind, if you can define that just for our audience. And I've also recently heard that there are some UK-based institutions implementing extended degree programs now for the first time, right? And in South Africa, there's been a long history of that. And of course, from your PhD, there's been some insight. So maybe if you can just frame a little bit like why they existed, what was the purpose of them, and what they are, just for us to contextualize that a bit.
Yeah, sure. So in my PhD, I called them foundation programs. That's what they were originally called. And there used to be a bridging year. So students would come on this program before to kind of upskill them, I suppose, or kind of equip them to cope with university study. And we're talking about engineering foundation programs here. So that's what they were. But then a policy decision was made that there can't be these standalone bridging programs, because it means students could come into the program, fail, and having spent a lot of money and actually exit with no credits and nothing to show for it. So it was decided to bring these programs into the higher education system and essentially extend the first 2 years of an engineering degree to 3 years. So that would mean your 4-year degree would become a 5-year degree. And there was a special funding mechanism associated with them because of the extra contact time that students would have, especially in maths and physics in first year. So that's kind of where they ended up. And there was a bit of an evolution and all sorts of different models as well. But that's where they ended up in terms of policy. My research actually looked at them as social entities. So not what they allege to do or purport to do, which might be laid out in the documentation around what they're supposed to do and address student disadvantage and all those sorts of things. But Bourdieu allowed me to look at what they maybe unconsciously do or inadvertently do. And my finding was that, first of all, to understand higher education, we've got to understand that research is really important in higher education, and the kind of activities associated with research and the kind of privilege or the kind of kudos associated with research really outweigh anything to do with teaching. And that really defines space. Now we could argue that, of course, you could say, well, no, these are equally important. But if you're looking at the system in terms of power and in terms of what it gets you, and yeah, and Bourdieu's whole idea of social fields, that's what actually it's pretty clear that's how it comes out. So what extended degree programs do or foundation programs do is they have a space to kind of shield the academics working on them. And let me maybe be clear, I was actually looking at staff, not so much students on these programs, but looking at the staff on these programs and how they behave within the system. And what they actually end up doing is they actually end up shielding the staff, or I mean, the wording I used was kind of carving out a space within higher education where staff teaching on these programs don't really have to do research. That's not really, they're kind of shielded from the drive to do research. Everyone else is subject to this really strong drive to do research. And so what my finding was that they address the issue of student disadvantage by kind of creating a temporary space where the special teaching can happen, but actually to just allow the university to do what's traditionally done, and that is just go on to really valuing research. Allowing the university just to do what is most important in its own eyes. I guess what what is part of its autonomous space. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That's the idea. So that is what's really important. And so foundation programs enable that. I mean, as I said, you can't really take that anywhere. It's just a bit of an interesting kind of insight. I mean, I suppose you could use it to leverage certain things, but it is a bit of it doesn't really leave you with that much room to move. So that's why I think it hasn't been madly taken up by people in the space.
Bruce, so, taking that idea of not just knowledge for knowledge's sake, but how any of us, whether as academics or engineers, we operate in the real world, in the society. Things we do have impacts out there. And you've been absolutely key in terms of including coursework in a mechanical engineering curriculum, which gets students to think about these things, specifically your course in engineering society. Do you want to talk a little bit about where that course kind of grew out of and some of the things that are involved over there and how that interacts with the rest of the curriculum?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it stems from me, coming into engineering, kind of wanting to do something with it in terms of, maybe doing something for the environment or whatever. So I never really came into engineering with the view of the technical stuff. So maybe that's where it stems from. But when I had the opportunity to lead this course, which you might call a complementary studies course in the department, then I and another colleague, Corinne Shaw, developed this course, Engineering Society, and also another one, Engineering Business. There were a few complementary studies courses in the curriculum that we decided to, as part of a larger curriculum change, decided to bring together, kind of consolidate. And one of them ended up being Engineering Society. There's actually a classic book written called The Engineering Society, I think from 1948 by someone called Mills, something like that, quite a while ago. And it's actually, I mean, it's a very simple idea, but it's amazing how it's kind of, I mean, I guess the issues related to society and other things, even like economics and all sorts of other things, get very much sidelined in engineering because engineering is seen to be the technical stuff. But engineering is also meant to be a socio-technical endeavor. Without people, we wouldn't have engineering, right? So, I mean, that's my real interest. So I got involved in this course, and the way we put it together was looking first at engineers in human society, with a view to tailoring it to South Africa. So we're in South Africa, so it makes sense to tailor it to the South African context, and then also look at the biophysical environment and economic systems and political structures as well. So it's kind of the engineer looking outward, and looking to these other parts of I guess of society, or other parts of what the context in which they might work, I suppose. It's quite a difficult space, I think, for students. I mean, even now, I'm trying to bring it into my second year course. I teach a course in dynamics, and you know, students that come to university because they're brilliant at maths and science, but to sort of talk to them about health and safety or economics or politics, it's quite different for them. So take that into account, and we try and help students understand why this is important. Initially, we actually got a lot of pushback from students. Like, we don't have to learn this stuff. What is this stuff about? But I think as we improve the course over the years, some students don't like the course at all, actually. But other students really like it. They really like this idea that engineering is more than just equations and design, technical design. It's got a much bigger, it's much broader, actually. So that's what the course is about. I mean, I can tell you about a research project that's come out of that, actually. When we were teaching around the role of engineers in South Africa pre-apartheid, we took a book from the South African Institute for Mechanical Engineers, SAIMechE, and looked at their centenary book from 1892 to 1992, and looked at some of the kind of engineering achievements. Engineers always talk about themselves in very kind of heroic terms. So it was these kind of heroic stories of mining and water and food and beverage and all these sorts of things. And then our plan was to ask the students at the end, so to what extent were engineers responsible for apartheid? Using a quote from Brian Kamanzi, who wrote a paper about engineers and the Americana massacre, actually. And he said, engineers, we have blood on our hands. So I asked the questions, do engineers have blood on their hands for their role in apartheid? And actually, before I said that, I remember the first time I was teaching the course, and before I said that, kind of said to myself, said out loud, like, we never talk about this stuff. No, here we are in democratic South Africa, and engineers never talk about politics, which is like, don't do it. Anyway, so I asked the question, and it was really a nice, lively discussion, which you would obviously think students would say. Would be, of course, they're culpable. I mean, of course, they're responsible. They didn't care about what other people were going through or suffering, and they helped build up apartheid. So one student kind of said, you can't really blame them. They were maybe only looking out for their families. But the general sentiment was they're absolutely responsible for what happened under apartheid. So we decided to find out. Myself and my co-lecturer, Corin Shaw, decided to find out, and we launched a research project, and we interviewed engineering academics, which gave us actually a really nice cross-section of engineers that had worked in different disciplines within engineering. So all the big ones anyway: civil, chemical, mechanical, electrical. But also had a lot of time in practice. So they were not only academics, they'd worked in academia, but they also worked in industry as well, some of them for many years, and gave incredible insights into how it was to being an engineer under apartheid, and the kind of choices they had to make and the kind of difficulties associated with it. Yeah, really fascinating. And something actually after the interviews, what we found was that we hadn't really encountered anyone that really challenged the system. And we looked at what we knew was kind of the spectrum of experience under apartheid, and decided we need to actually find some people that had actually gone up against the system. And we managed to find two. And they're kind of stories of heroism, actually, real heroism, in standing up against the system. One going to jail for a year, another one, his family was exiled, and then he decided to come back to South Africa. And it's just, amazing. I think when a lot of people were just kind of trying to keep their noses clean and trying to keep out of the way of the apartheid police, there were engineers who were willing to stand up against an unjust system. So it's kind of a personal story, I think, for all engineers, actually. And I think for people that grew up under apartheid, it kind of touches a nerve, because I think a lot of people realize they sat by when terrible things were actually going on, and they didn't have the courage to stand up. And I think that's the general sense. But it's also, I guess, a story of hope, where you can actually stand up against an unjust system.
It is, and it takes incredible courage to ask those questions, because on so many sides, experiences and what people did back then were complicated and messy, right?
Mm.
And that it can be quite easy to frame the apartheid experience in terms of white and non-white, but people often forget that, like, there was a hierarchy, and that we would be hypocritical to pretend that there weren't kind of tensions and power dynamics that happened between other, within the broader black community, that in apartheid there would have been power and hierarchical tensions between the Indian community and the Zulu community in KZN, that
Yeah.
all, kind of mapped out around these things. And if I certainly think about my parents' generation, people were deeply, deeply uncomfortable about having these conversations in a mixed space. That there were attitudes that people might speak about around the family lunch table that you'd
Mm.
you'd you'd admit to in that space, but that you couldn't possibly admit to that in a different space. Anyhow, so it's Bruce. I think it's amazing that you've been able to ask these questions, and occasionally that not occasionally, the very often really messy truths kind of have to start bubbling up and
Mhm.
coming over there. You're touching sort of engineers both in academia and in industry and historically, which is really amazing.
Bruce, I think I agree with Ruben. I think there's a component of complexity, a complexity that you're actively and intentionally bringing into the classroom that's also really grounded in kind of a shared history of all of us in the country. And I think at different ages, I think what was interesting to me, and of course I knew of the module and I read the paper that you're referring to, and we'll definitely make sure to put that as a connection in the notes. And for me, growing up, I was a child when it changed. Like I was 10 years old, so I wasn't like that conscious of what exactly was going on. But reading that and almost reading that as a way to understand what that generation went through, that could have had an influence, and some had an influence, and some that didn't necessarily choose to have an influence in that way. You've not only actually engaged, I mean, me as an audience member. So I think in the same way with your students, there are students that will really be engaged with this, and it will open up broader conversations in their own personal ecosystems, and it will also help them reflect on and feel into what their own position is in this kind of broader sequence of events that we live through. So I think that's such a powerful tool to bring into the classroom. I think what I'm really curious about is how did your colleagues respond to this? Like, is it something that you discussed in the department before you did? Is it something that everyone agreed on? Does everyone feel comfortable? Because you did mention that some students still don't like it and some really love it, right? And I'm wondering if you have some, like, who loves it, who doesn't like it, like, and what are your colleagues like? How do they engage with it?
Okay. I mean, we never asked anyone if we could do this kind of thing. And I guess it kind of just happened. I mean, I suppose it was also around, if we want to talk about societies, this is engineering society. We want to talk about society. I mean, what is the biggest thing that marks South African society? It's apartheid, right? So, I mean, it makes sense for a course like this to engage somehow with apartheid. And how do we do it? Well, I mean, engineers were involved under apartheid. The question was like, how were these engineers, which are technically minded, I mean, how did they interact with this, or I suppose contribute to this political system? And I guess it's kind of obvious to us, like, this is what you got to do. And I mean, that's maybe why I said that to myself. Like, we don't talk about this stuff. I mean, when I first taught this course, it was 2020. So, I mean, it's like 25 years after apartheid fell. It's like, better start talking about this stuff sometime. We thought about this, myself and Corin, and kind of wrote about it as well, actually. I mean, what I think was most jarring for students is, I mean, not so much, I mean, it is an uncomfortable thing sometimes to talk about, but I think what was probably more interesting was that students, we think that it kind of challenged their identity, because engineering students are really good at maths and science, and that's kind of who you see yourself as. And you know that you got to this is how you do the work, and these are the equations you plug in or whatever, and you're going to get the good marks. But here were students who had done that, and they just weren't getting. They'd done what they thought needed to be done, and they just weren't getting good marks. And I think that was really frustrating. I think that's what actually drove like quite a lot of the early kind of pushback in the course. Like this is not our stuff. I mean, one student in a course evaluation kind of said this is LO, this is life orientation, which is, for those that don't know, it's supposed to be quite an easy course at high school. So you kind of this is not really for marks. That's kind of what it was, what the kind of feeling was. Because we're talking about all this stuff, which is all subjective, and it's you can't really say anything about these things. I mean, I think there was an aspect. I think there are some students that come through the white middle class system, Rondebosch boys or whatever, and they just like don't want to hear this stuff. They're not interested. They came to engineering to to do other things than to talk about apartheid. There is an element of that, I think. I mean, I got pushback from students, also black students, saying like, we don't want a white guy talking to us about racism. So there was that kind of pushback as well. So as far as my colleagues go, I mean, I am quite excited about this course. So I share with my colleagues about it, and like all the colleagues I've spoken to have been like, "Wow, that's really cool. That sounds like a great course." I mean, one colleague, yeah, teaches in another faculty, and he thought he's going to actually try and talk to his students about how about the role of engineers under apartheid. He said it didn't go that well. Actually, they were a bit kind of shell shocked. But generally, it's been. I think colleagues have appreciated it. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's those that don't appreciate it won't tell me. I really like what it does in terms of opening up students to think about broader questions. I mean, one of the things we do as part of our engineering ethics component of this course as well is we talk about current day corruption in South Africa. And that's fascinating as well. We actually get someone in who's been in industry and experienced doing engineering in the public sector, and like stuff that goes on about bribery and fraud and corruption or whatever. And actually the students loved that lecture this year. It actually made quite a lot of students scared, because this colleague talked about, there are assassinations that are happening in South Africa. Engineers that refuse to take the bribe, they aren't just left alone. I mean, some of them are assassinated. It's a reality. And so quite a lot of students were a bit scared about that, actually. And we had to kind of show them this is not every experience. This is just one experience. And there are engineering jobs in the private sector and other public sectors, areas where this is not the norm. But I think students, I mean, I guess they loved the kind of the story around it. Certainly some students did. But I think our purpose for doing that actually was also getting students to think about ethics in a different way. And it's not a kind of set of rules that you have to kind of look at and say, oh, you must do this and you must do this right. This kind of abstract set of rules. It's actually something which actually is tangible in engineering work in all sorts of ways that we don't really think about. But this kind of helps to bring it to the surface. So I suppose, thinking about engineering and the role of engineers in South Africa pre-apartheid is very much, I guess, an ethical question. Maybe students would ask this of themselves, to what extent are we going into a system where there are these kinds of ethical things that we're going to have to deal with? And are we prepared for it? And can we think clearly enough to make the right decision in those sorts of situations?
Bruce, there's so much there. You think about the historical lessons that become socially and politically relevant now. AI is the current big hype, and it's so easy for an engineer who's sitting at their desk hammering away at code for some AI thing to go, I'm just an engineer writing code. Where'd you get the data that your AI got trained on? And that if you succeed at your job and you train the AI to do this task well, what are the implications for people who used to do those tasks for employment? It is so easy in job spaces where, again, one gets to hide behind a keyboard and thousands of lines of code. It's super different from, perhaps when one went out into the field. But I also think it is, again, hugely valuable and hugely important that our students get exposed to these questions while they are students, right? So that they get to make decisions about where do they go and work. and
Yeah,
what
yeah.
kind of companies do they want to work for, and how are they going to put everything that they learned at university into use over there. So I just really want to applaud how you create the spaces and you initiate the conversations for our students to do these things. It's not just small corridor conversations, it's
Mm.
real classroom stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, we actually recently had an amazing lecture from someone from NEXA, the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa. And incredible lecture. I mean, it was about technopolitics, and it was about how nuclear is kind of the epitome of technopolitics, following the Manhattan Project and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how that transitioned into Eisenhower's kind of atoms for peace, and what America tried to do with atoms for peace around the world, and exposing students to these kinds of things. South Africa is the only country to get nuclear weapons and then voluntarily disarm. What does that say about South Africa in that sense? Really interesting. And then about the nuclear energy, nuclear power generation, and what it means. And I didn't even know, but I mean, after this lecture, I learned that South Africa is actually really far ahead when it comes to medical isotopes and that kind of nuclear research, something we don't really hear about, but South Africa is actually really cutting edge in that sense. So, but yeah, just kind of fascinating to kind of weave together the technical and the political in thinking about nuclear. And it's quite a relevant thing for students now, looking at the climate crisis and thinking about options, that nuclear is an option, but students have quite naive views about these things. So what was really nice about this was getting kind of an expert in to kind of show students that this is a complex space, and making decisions about the way forward is not just simply like trying to convince everyone like this is the solution, like follow me.
I think, Bruce, it's so incredible because you're bringing the world to them in a very specific way, and you allow them to grapple in a safe place with complexity that they will be faced with when they move into society. And I think that's so important. And I want to agree with Ruben. I think it's not an easy space to hold, especially in a context like ours, like you're saying, like you're getting pushback from different side around different things.
Yeah.
It's a contentious thing to bring into a profession, especially that has sometimes got this kind of preconceived idea that it's very technical,
Mm.
mathematical, scientific focus, and engineering is very social. It is very political. You cannot ever. I mean, we are creating and designing and inventing for society. Like it's not. That's the kind of platform we serve. So, and it's often, I think, neglected for two reasons. I think sometimes academics don't know necessarily how to bring it in, and personally, I would want to say like there's also a component of fear when you bring it in. The backlash. Like, can you sit with that discomfort? Because now you have to sit with your own discomfort, with your students' discomfort, and almost like facilitate that in a specific way. And I think it's incredible to have that experience and also to write about it in the way that you and Karen have. I think that's so meaningful. And I cannot wait for the next paper.
Thank you. It's
So,
yeah, it's I'm just speaking to my HOD to get me some time off because it's so many other things to do. But we're looking forward. Yeah, actually, it's a paper about culpability because we felt we didn't really address the idea of culpability in the last paper. And kind of what is complicity and what is culpability, and a lot of it was around did engineers really know what they were doing? And some of the respondents kind of said, like, of course we knew what actually was happening. But other respondents, like, they kind of just they didn't see it. They didn't see it. Only now they can look back, say, now I realize now that I was part of a system and I was part of something that was not good. And some are kind of, I guess, in different stages of kind of denial as well. Anyway, so we want to kind of address that more kind of, I guess, theoretically and thinking about culpability in engineering.
Thank you, Bruce, and for being willing to ask the provocative questions and getting the students to get comfortable with being uncomfortable on a regular basis. Because it's not like the questions stop when they finish the degree. This is such a big part of preparing them and all of us for a better future in many, many ways. So
Mhm.
thank you for all of that stuff and the input and the changes that you're making.
Bruce, if you could choose a way that the work that you're doing influences industry, what would that be if you want to be idealistic? Maybe if we can do that and maybe then wrap up with like, what can we look forward to? What's coming next? What's exciting for you, Bruce, that's coming up next? So,
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so something which I think has really helped students understand why we'd have a course like this is the work of James Trevelyan. And we introduced the students to that early on because what he's found in his work is that engineering work is mostly social, actually. He has a lot of data that's analyzed, and across different disciplines, graduates early on in their work in industry, they spend about 60% of their time in doing social stuff, social interactions, and he's got a lovely, amazing way of framing it as around engineers using their technical expertise, but to get things done outside of the lines of formal authority. So, whether it's a set of apprentices, a team of apprentices, getting that team to get things done, or liaising with a client, or talking within the institution in your team, whatever. And a lot of it is actually social stuff. And so I show the students, I mean, what's interesting about his work as well is he says that when he was interviewing engineers, they would sometimes respond like, that stuff I do is not really engineering. So they didn't actually see that what they were doing was part of this broader ambit of what an engineer does. They kind of only saw the narrowly technical stuff as being the real engineering. But what he talks about is that it's distributed expertise. That's one way he kind of talks about it, is that it's actually the technical is there in the background, and you wouldn't be able to do the social stuff without the technical, actually. So it's this kind of bringing together the social and the technical. And I use it to show the students that the work that you do as an engineer is actually very social. You don't actually see it in that way, but it is actually very social. And his work is actually like finding out what engineers do, but by going to the practice and actually looking at the time spent on the different activities, and then saying, this is actually what engineers do. Because students, I mean, if you ask students, I actually had a great time with our first years this year, because I was in charge of the orientation for the faculty as well. So I had a chance with our mechanical engineering students, and I said, okay, what do engineers do? Engineers solve problems. Okay, how do you solve the problems? Well, we find problems to solve and we solve the problems. Okay, and so where do you find? And they said, we do research and then we find out problems to solve. So I said, guys, you work in companies. Engineers work in companies. You have to make a profit. You have work to do in that sense. So kind of just getting them to think that, and this is the work of Aslaksen, who's written about engineers being embedded in industry. Engineers are very much embedded in industry. They're kind of working in the background. And people don't often see what engineers do because there's so much kind of in the background there. So I think, if it comes to industry, it's actually really nice to get people from industry to talk to students and for them to be able to see the reality of what actually happens in industry, and get them to focus not only on the kind of what we might see as the technical engineering, but like the broader context in which this actually happens, the broader social context in which this happens. So that's one way I would like to see it linking to industry. Part of it is also and it really struck home this year, actually. It was very interesting. And I gave the students a paper by Trevelyan, who methodologically, I mean, he's interviewing academics, looking what they did with their time and everything. And a student actually responded in the feedback and said, like, in this age of misinformation, I should look carefully at the kind of papers that I'm giving them because, the conclusions reached by some of these authors is just like subjective. And I'm like, but where did the student get that from? That kind of scientific research and quantitative data is like the only valid thing. And so it's this kind of fascinating, it's a much deeper thing. Students it's a third year student is already kind of thinks in those ways. So it's kind of, I guess, a paradigm shift as well, getting students to think about these things. This is complex stuff. Society is complex. It takes a sort of a way of thinking to open yourself up to thinking about these sorts of things, because as some of the respondents in the interviews that we did, engineers operate in a very kind of way which is sort of very safe, zeros and ones, and and you don't kind of think outside of that. And then the world is all very clean, but he was actually saying, when you get into kind of management, it gets very messy. If you get into politics, it gets like seriously dirty. So it's actually quite a kind of a sheltered space that engineers can stay into, and actually straying out of that space and getting into these very messy questions, I think is actually takes a bit of courage. Shouldn't be seen as soft skills, actually really critical skills.
Incredibly important that the ideas of professional competencies rather than as you said, soft skills is such a misnomer. And I love the perspective of digitally based decisions versus a world that is analog and fuzzy. And there's noise on the real world information that we're constantly dealing with. So I think that's probably a good place to draw the line. Thank you again, Bruce. It's been so insightful to listen and remember the value that you add to our space. So to the listeners who might want to read a bit more or delve into the detail of what Bruce is doing, we'll have some links to some of the papers that Bruce has written and perhaps some of the other texts that he's referred to that might be helpful for extending your understanding of this. People can tune in later. We'll keep having conversations about the intersection of engineering, education, and society, and keep on asking difficult, messy, uncomfortable questions where they need to be asked. So, thank you to everybody.